The sound of thunder in the Conejos Range of the San Juan Mountains is pervasive every summer, as it has been for eons. Monsoon storms, convected from moisture originating out of the Gulf of California, and to a lesser extent, Gulf of Mexico, are whipped up into the upper atmosphere by heat currents from the mountains. Lightning will be created in these storms to fix the imbalance between the atmosphere and the ground, shaking the earth with its thunder. But for the last century and a half, the Conejos has been pelted with the thunder of another kind, the man-made kind. This man-made thunder, brought upon the earth by the diminutive steam locomotives of the Denver and Rio Grande, and later the larger brethren of the later reorganization into the Denver and Rio Grande Western, rolled across the range until the winter of 1968, when the mountains were once again only shook by nature. In its void, the Cumbres and Toltec Scenic Railroad resumed regular operations over the lofty summit in 1971. The backbone of its fleet was the most modern class of locomotives the Grand would ever run on this line, the K-36 class. Forged in the foundries and halls of the Baldwin Locomotive Works of Philadelphia, these 10 locomotives arrived on the Grand at Salida in 1925, and would be the last all-new power the railroad would purchase for its extensive narrow-gauge network, which by then had been whittled down to lines radiating from Salida, westward over Marshall Pass to Montrose, and another artery that stretched down over Poncha, through the San Luis Valley to Santa Fe, or over the Conejos to Durango, Farmington, and Silverton. Even being some of the newest power, these brutes would be restricted in their early days until the physical plant of the lines could be upgraded. And even then, there would be locales where the locomotives would never venture, such as west of Gunnison through the Black Canyon, or down the escarpment into Espanola and Santa Fe along the Chile line. Even the Silverton would not see a locomotive as large as the 480s until 1981, when the newly formed Durango and Silverton brought 481 just past the gates of Rockwood Cut after much work to the bridges had been performed. The locomotives would primarily be a freight locomotive, but could be seen pinch-hitting on passenger trains. Though, after the railroad offered up 7 of the K-28 class, some of the railroad's primary narrow-gauge passenger power to the war effort in Alaska following Pearl Harbor, the 480s could be seen hauling the San Juan, the daily passenger and mail train between Durango and Alamosa until that train's demise in 1951. If one were to measure the success of a locomotive class, one metric that some might use is the number of locomotives preserved, which can be quite low as many a class of locomotive have been completely removed from existence, or only have 1 or 2 of a large numbers to survive the scrap drives. Today, 90% of the K-36 survive to this day, with only one being scrapped, the wayward 485, which waddled its way into the turntable pit at Salida, straddling the edge of the table and landing on its side with such a thud that management made the decision to scrap it. And with the remains, every one of them has been under steam in the last 50 years, a feat which can hardly be replicated. Today, only 2 are out of service. 483, having not steamed since being set aside for heavy maintenance in the 1970s, and 486 in Durango, awaiting its time in the shop, residing in the museum. In 2025, for the 100th anniversary of their construction, the Cumbres and Toltec planned out the 3rd weekend in August to have a celebration in honor of these horses. The railroad had events and special operations with all 3 of its available K-36s, 484, 487, and 488, interspersed over 4 days. On Thursday, 487 would pull what was billed as a chance to ride a freight train, though it would have 2 coaches tacked on behind the caboose to allow the general public to ride. On Friday, 488 and 484 would double-head the western slope of Cumbres Pass, moving 2 separate Cumbres Turns to the summit, one in the morning and one in the afternoon, allowing for a recreation of historic freight moves over the line. Cumbres Turns were the practice of splitting long freight trains into 2 or more sections to allow for the locomotives to pull heavy trains up the steep side of the pass, and allowing the long, recombined train to drift down the grade to the east. Saturday would find this action in practice, as the 484 would guide this train from Cumbres to Antonito, hiding its passengers in stealth boxcars, restored on the exterior to their historic appearance. Finally, before dawn, on Sunday, the train would head back west, with the 488 in the lead, and 484 cut into the middle of the train, as per Denver and Rio Grande Western operating practice, to allow for even distribution of power like on today's freight trains, and also to make sure that two locomotives under steam would not be on the Cascade Trestle at the same time. Join me as we embark on a journey to nearly a century ago, following and riding these historic locomotives across this renowned railroad pass. Our journey commences at Chama, New Mexico, situated at Jukes Tree. This location marks the only crossing of the Rio Chama by the railroad, utilizing the railroad's sole truss span, and the only one on the modern Cumbres and Toltec. Meanwhile, the tree itself is a long-time photographer's spot, where this ancient ponderosa has cast its shadow on the tracks since time immemorial. Meanwhile, on the other side of the railroad, we've departed Antonito, Colorado, and left the standard gauge rails of the world behind. Departing before dawn, we're riding the train to Hangman's, or Ferguson's Trestle, so named because of the legend that in the early days of the railroad, in the 19th century, a group inflicting their own vigilante justice ran a locomotive to this spot to find a high spot to hang an outlaw. While the trestle here looks vintage, it's less than 40 years old today. A reconstruction after pyrotechnics from the movie Where the Hell's That Gold, where a dynamite charge set off by none other than Willie Nelson would consume the structure. This morning, we're on hand to watch the sunrise over the Sangre de Cristo Mountains on the far side of the San Luis Valley, and the Rio Grande, where they form the southern spine of the Rocky Mountains, extending past Taos, all the way to Santa Fe at Glorieta Pass. As the train leaves Antonito, rising from the floor of the San Luis Valley is Blanca Peak, Colorado's fourth highest peak, an elevation of 14,351 feet above sea level, and forms the far-off background near Great Sand Dunes National Park. Leaving Chama, we find ourselves traveling by Broad Spur, the site of a long ago abandoned lumber mill at this location. Today we catch 488 leading a freight train with sister 484 pushing on the rear. While it requires extra switching to have the caboose on the rear, which is a practice dating back to the Grand, this helps avoid excessive buff forces on the wooden car, which could turn it into splinters. Just beyond Broad Spur, the railroad tucks in its elbows as it enters the Narrows, where the canyon of the Rio Chama exits the Conejos Range, and the river, railroad, and State Highway 17 are all nearly atop each other in this gorge. Back east, we hop back on the freight westward. We head up from Hangman's Trestle towards Lava and climb State Line Hill, where the line loops up the escarpment formed by an ancient flow of lava that has eroded away. Once atop this mesa, we'll loop it onto another escarpment and arrive at Lava Tank, the first place to get water after leaving Antonito. While not currently able to pump water out of the Rio de los Pinos in the valley far below, the tank, using a steel one hidden inside, can be used to fill thirsty locomotives using water hauled in using tank cars and pumped in. At Lake Lobato, we catch the Cumbres Turn leaving the Narrows as it rolls over the embankment that forms the lake here, though the prolonged drought here has reduced it to a mere meadow. At the Lobato siding, the rideable freight train, led by 487, rolls past the fake water tank, most famously used for the famous introduction to Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade, where River Phoenix attempts to use its spout to evade capture by his antagonists. Just afterwards, the railroad leaps over Wolf Creek, a tributary of the Rio Chama, on the railroad's second highest bridge, Lobato Trestle. After filling up the locomotives at the old section crew town of Sublet, we're at milepost 309, where the railroad hugs the mountainside high above the Rio de los Pinos, on a series of reverse curves before ducking into a fragile rock cut of shattered igneous rock. Above Lobato, the railroad loops around a horseshoe to reach Dalton, where above the Lobo Lodge of long ago, Banded Peak rises high above the Rio Chama Valley, located over the ridge behind the train. In the afternoon, we catch the Cumbres Turn passing the station sign at Dalton, where Rabbit Peak can be seen far behind, a marker on the landscape showing where we started our journey in Chama. Tucked in the alcove drained by Toltec Creek, between mud and rock tunnels, volcanic spires of crumbling rock form the hoodoos of Phantom Curve, named for the shadows cast upon the walls from the oil-burning headlamps of old. Above Dalton, the line crosses Highway 17 for the second time after leaving Chama. Here, the line weaves along a grassy slope high above Wolf Creek. After threading through the hole created in the Toltec Gorge, known as Rock Tunnel, we find the westbound high above the chasm as it steams on the ever-continuing grade. Below Cresco, the first location where thirsty locomotives can take a drink, the line hugs the slippery slope of volcanic debris that make up the state line curves. As the valley of Wolf Creek tightens into another small canyon, we find the 487 tugging on the rideable freight train near Hamilton's Point on Thursday. Following day, we find the morning section of the Cumbres Turn threading the gap at the same location. Cascade Trestle, the highest span on the line, jumps over the rivulet of the same name 137 feet below. Today we see 488 and 484 separated, per rule, to keep the locomotives as far apart to prevent doubleheading across the span. The Los Pinos Valley, one of the few level places since Antonito, is a high, flat valley formed by glaciers. Here, the railroad threads its way past the terminal moraine at the south end of the valley, as it follows the Rio de los Pinos to the north end of the valley, where it crosses over the river on a pile trestle, and loops around to the west side, where it resumes its climb towards Cumbres. Here, today, we'll watch it as it loops its way from the east to the west. Below Cumbres and Windy Point on the western slope, we're at the site of the original highway crossing, where we catch the morning Cumbres turn. Making the final push to Cumbres, on the other side of the divide, we find the westbound with its mid-train helper, winding around the Cumbres Loop, better known as Tanglefoot Curve, a meandering piece of trackage where the rails change direction for one final time. High above Coxo and its adjacent crossing, we're on the Continental Divide Trail, where we first see 487 maxed out, struggling up the 4% grade, pulling the daily train from the gorge near Hamilton's Point towards the crossing. Coxo, tucked into a tightening valley, is the final level spot before Cumbres, and we find the afternoon Cumbres turn making the run for Windy Point, rounding the horseshoe hidden above the highway. Back on the Continental Divide Trail, we're looking down at Windy Point as the morning Cumbres turn rounds the volcanic spires on its final attack. Having surmounted the summit, 487 and its rideable freight train tips over the summit to allow itself to back into the Y, where she and her train will be turned for the journey westward back towards Chama. Once turned, the 487 will spot at the standpipe that feeds the thirsty cistern. As the tank is filled, the train crew will perform a requisite brake test, making sure that the brakes applied properly. Any car not able to pass the test will have to be fixed, or will have to be set out, as all trains departing must have 100% operable brakes.
Hey guys, big deal here. Care for another video in these trying times? Well, check out one of these here. And if you're new to the channel and you haven't already, make sure you click subscribe. I'd like to thank you for watching. Make sure you click like if you really like this video. And if you didn't, let me hear in the comments. We'll see you next time on the next one.